Welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Aisha Curry, and I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate the incredible Holly Lee and her new book, The Big We, which, yes, I just so happen to be very honored to help her publish this book through my imprint, Sweet July Books. When I first read The Big We, I immediately was energized by Holly's fresh, more expansive, and more inclusive vision of philanthropy. For years, Holly has been helping redefine what generosity at scale can look like in the 21st century. She co-founded the Donors of Color Network, which seeks to democratize and diversify philanthropy through the power of collective giving. And she founded the Asian Women Giving Circle, which has provided millions of dollars of support to art and activism in New York City. So just all around badass. At the center of Holly's visions are giving circles, which she's going to be able to explain better than anyone here tonight. And the idea that philanthropy is a collective force rooted in the best human impulse to come together for the greater good. Her work reminds us that the power to create change doesn't lie in how much we have, it lies in how much we care and what we choose to do together. This book is so beautifully written and has already taught me so many valuable lessons that I'm putting into my own work with Eat, Learn, Play. It's the foundation that I founded with my husband, Stefan, and we founded it to better the school experience for a generation of Oakland students. I am very grateful that you have come out this evening to learn more about The Big We and to help celebrate all of the people like Holly who are redefining generosity. We have a great evening tonight with a conversation moderated by the amazing Mina Kim, co-host of Forum on KQED. And so with that, without further ado, I'd love to introduce you all to the incomparable author of The Big We, Holly Lee.
Thank you. Have fun tonight.
Thanks, Aisha. Oh, good evening, everybody.
Hello.
It's wonderful to see this room coming out for Aisha and also for Holly. So first of all, congratulations on the book.
Thanks, Mina.
Printed through Aisha's new imprint, Sweet July.
Thank you, Aisha Curry, for taking a risk on this first-time author. It's such an honor to be published her first nonfiction book out of Sweet July, which is really cool.
Yay! Wow, I didn't realize it's also your first.
Yeah, I know, I'm a virgin, no longer.
So how does it feel to have it out in the world?
It's a little scary, it's a little bit like being naked, but I've done a lot of writing and a lot of doing things, so it's not an unfamiliar feeling to be naked in public, but it's just a little more of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's actually a moment in your book that is so identical to an experience that I had that for a moment, it felt like you were almost telling my own story about my own incident. That it was when you were talking about being in first or second grade and you were basically chased, taunted by a group of older boys all the way home from school one day. Could you just tell that story?
Yeah, but first I want to know, where did you grow up?
I grew up in St. John's, Newfoundland.
Oh, God.
So it was a community where there were very few Asians.
Americans.
Yes.
I want to know more about that. Okay, we'll do that after tonight. So I grew up in Kansas City, in a suburb on the Kansas side of a city that straddles two states, Missouri and Kansas. And my brother and I were always the only kids of Asian descent in our school, public school. And until Kim Wong came in 5th grade, and Kim and I are friends to this day. Our family had Imperial Palace, which was the nice Chinese restaurant in town. So about once a year, something kind of terrible would happen to me and my brother that had to do with othering and race. And I was in 1st grade, and my brother was in kindergarten, and we're 1 year apart. And this group of giant, enormous 6th grade boys, they were the oldest in my elementary school, chased us home from school. We could walk to school doing that taunt, Chinese, Japanese dirty knees. I don't know if any of you guys remember that. This would have been in the 70s in Kansas City. And I thought for sure that we were going to die. So we're running and sweating. We go into my house, and the hero of the story is my mom. So she chases the two boys. She catches one of them by the back of his shirt, brings him into our house, makes him call his mom to tell his mom what he had done. By this time, this boy is a sweaty, crying. I felt sorry for him, actually. And then she called Mr. Dill, who is the principal of our school. And multiple things like this happened growing up about once a year. So in lots of ways, it was a really great place to grow up because we could play outdoors and our backyards connected and the world was available in a way, but on the other hand, not so great.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. These things happen. It actually wasn't terribly surprising to me that it happened to you as well. It's almost like this negative Asian rite of passage or something. But I was so struck by the similarity to the very slur and also to the fact that my mother stepped in and the kid was a blubbering mess after she stepped in and grabbed him when she saw what he was doing, and then also threatened to take him to go confront the principal because she actually saw it on school grounds. She was picking me up from school and saw this.
So happy Mother's Day, Mom.
I know, right? So we both had moms who like completely intervened in that. But yeah, of course we both experienced it because it was the same structures that, you know, contribute to an incident like that. But I really appreciated then how you told that story in the context of belonging. The fact that you haven't been made to feel like we belong to the American story, and then you extend that to the fact that we are not made to feel like we belong to the American philanthropic story. So can you say a little bit more about that?
I would bet money that a lot of us in this room have navigated spaces where we've had to be the bridge builder or the ambassador or the translator in various spaces, whether it be in our families or workspaces, or in my case, in Sadi's case, in Masha's case, and Daniel's case in this room, in philanthropic spaces. And I write in my book that this is an American, the issue of who belongs or not is very much alive to this day. And we're seeing it play out in local, state, and federal levels. And it happens in philanthropic spaces as well. And I think I've spent most of my career trying to sort of like state in some way, I belong here, though in some rooms, like I tell this story too, it's been told to my face that no, you do not belong here. The Donors of Color Project in Build was an effort in a way to write people of color into the philanthropic story in America, because that story has been told mostly as a white story, a white male story, and sometimes a dead white male story. So in some ways, that body of work that many of us in this room are engaged in is an attempt to write people of color into that story of philanthropy in the United States. And collective giving, I think, is another way of expanding the idea of what counts as philanthropy and who counts as a philanthropist. And people who are involved in collective giving and collective power are, I think, attempting to write in the story of groups of people who are coming together to make change into the story of change, change making, and justice fighting in this country.
So talk about who we do think of when we think of a traditional philanthropist. Talk about how we do see philanthropy stereotypically per se, or traditionally.
Tell me if you disagree, please. But you know, philanthropy as a practice and as a profession in this country kind of has its starts in the first Gilded Age in America, and that would be like Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller and Ford, and you know, these eponymous foundations exist to this day. We are living in a second Gilded Age in this country with huge fortunes made in tech and finance, and one only has to think about the three men sitting behind Donald Trump on the dais when he was inaugurated. It was Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg right on the dais on January, whatever it was. And those three men own and control as much wealth as 50% of Americans. So those three men own and control as much wealth as 170 million Americans. that's an oligarchy, and it's the same kind of wealth disparity and wealth inequity that existed, or maybe even worse, than existed in the first Gilded Age. And that, unfortunately, is the context in which philanthropy was born, and in which what I call Big Phil philanthropy currently exists, thrives, and lives today. And Big Phil, by Big Phil, it's a nickname that I fondly gave to Big Phil, Big Philanthropy, which is heroic, individualistic, rich guy knows best, and it's usually a guy, so I use that pronoun in this part of the book. That is the sun around which much of the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors revolves, and that's been the prevalent and predominant frame over the last 20 years in our sector. And it's problematic for lots of reasons. So at the end of part 1, I kindly and very politely asked Big Phil to retire in peace to make way for the rest of us who have been practicing philanthropy in groups and in a non-Big Phil way, always and forever.
Because talk about how so many business leaders, you've named so many business leaders, the history is very much steeped in people making money off of their businesses. How has that influenced, framed, created the structures that philanthropy operates through to this day and is even assessed by, too?
Yeah. So business-minded frames would be like strategic plans and logic models and KPIs, like applying business ideas and
KPIs
are known key performance indicators. That's how much I hate it. And honestly, I kind of liken it to like cramming a novel onto a spreadsheet. And in my opinion, like novels are better at telling the story about human dignity and joy and suffering and community. And many of us in this room have worked in nonprofits, and we've tried our best to perform and conform to logic models, known performance KPIs, and strategic plans. And it's impossible. It's like the languages don't always speak to one another. It makes sense that the people who made vast fortunes in tech and business and industry would apply these frames and models to this thing they're doing called philanthropy, because it's how they made so much money to begin with. So I would maybe do that if I had made $1 billion doing a tech business. I might apply some of those same frames, models, evaluative methods to my new thing, but it doesn't always fit. And sometimes it really feels like cramming a foot into something else that isn't made for a foot.
Yeah. So talk about the way to get out of the shadow of that sort of overarching philosophy of Big Phil. And tell the novel, right? Tell the story of Giving Circles. One of the things that I love so much, besides seeing my own bullying story represented, was also that my mom was part of GIZ.
Oh, yeah.
So tell everybody what a GIZ is.
Okay, I'd love to. I have to say one more thing about Big Phil.
Yes.
In our sector, 3 books were written, I think, in 2018 that were really great, but they were written by guys. So Edgar Villanueva's Decolonizing Wealth, and Rob Reich wrote Just Giving, and Anand Giridharadas wrote Winners Take All. And they were really good books. You should all read them. And basically, they're critiquing Big Phil. And my addition, and the summary, gross generalized summary of the argument is that Big Phil isn't that invested in changing the systems that made him so rich to begin with, right? And that makes sense.
Yeah.
To that argument, I would add, and I try to add in my book, that not only is Big Phil not interested in changing the systems in which he got so rich to begin with, but relying on Big Phil for the rest of us inspires a sort of passivity that is not good for our democracy. And our republic democracy system works only when its citizens, which would be you and me and all of us, care enough to get informed, to get educated, and then importantly link arms with our friends, neighbors, colleagues, book group mates, adult soccer league friends, whatever, in order to do an action together, or maybe 5, in order to address the things that we care about. And that's civic engagement. So relying on Big Phil, and I've done it as a development director and an ED, like maybe you've been part of a board where someone says, doesn't anyone in this room know Oprah? Or doesn't anyone in this room have a direct line to, Mackenzie? I've certainly done that and thought that. And wished for that, prayed for that. But it's not really the right way to build our civic muscle and build our civic society, because really the more democratic form and the more durable form, and honestly the more fun form, is to do it in partnership, to do these things in partnership with friends and neighbors. Yeah. So we're both Korean American. Hello, high five. I grew up in Kansas City, and my mom and dad were always or often part of a ge. And it's like a shared savings circle. So if there's 5 of us in a ge, and I've been parts of lots of very frivolous, very fun ge's with my girlfriends in New York City. If there were 5 of us in a ge and we were feeling very rich that cycle, we might decide to put $500 into the pot, and we would meet once a month at Ippudo, have ramen, and whoever's turn it was to take home that pot would pay for Ippudo and then take home $2,500 in that pot. 5 people times $500. When it was my turn, one time I bought myself a computer. Another time I knew I was going to have to throw a birthday party for my husband, a big one, so I used it for that. Or my buddy Shin, he bought a couch. My friend Minjin always bought herself a beautiful piece of jewelry. You could use it for whatever you wanted. You just had to kind of show and tell the next time. But I've heard of giant ge's in Queens that the pot might be $100,000. And someone might have to wait 5 years for their turn, but the pot would be so big that you could start a business, or you could make a down payment on something, or you could really send a kid off to college, or do something big. As I've been thinking about this book and in this work, I've been in collective giving as Society for literally 20 years. So we have a lot of stories, and it's been my pleasure to get to learn about other cultural forms of collectivizing and moving money together. So my Mexican friends call them tandas. My Indonesian girlfriend calls them arisan. My Ethiopian Eritrean workmate, buddy, sister practically, calls them mahiber. Maybe you've heard of susu or sol. I learned of a new one. What did the Filipina term that we heard about today? If Aisha's still here, I forget what, I just learned of a new one today. So this kind of cultural form of care, this cultural form of mutual aid, this cultural form of pooling resources in order to care for one another exists in all of our cultures. And I think one of the things that we can do to not be so reliant on Big Phil moving forward is to reconnect with our cultural roots of generosity and figure out how to turn that into a generosity practice today.
What I love about ge's is also the history of the ge, because essentially, well, especially for a lot of immigrants, it was a way to be able to get and collect enough money on a given month when it was your turn to take the pot to start a business or to pay for a big event that would lead to something. But it was also something that a lot of women did.
Yes.
Because many of them were excluded from, either being the person who brought home the paycheck every month or from banking systems and so on.
Exactly.
So this was,
totally.
an adaptation.
Totally, because we weren't allowed to bank. I mean, even in America till the 70s, women weren't allowed to have a bank account without the co-signing of their spouse. I mean, I was alive then, it's kind of wild. And in Korea, our parents' generation went through 2 wars that devastated our tiny country. The Japanese Imperial Army tried to erase Korean culture from the face of this earth. And then 5 short years later, there was a civil war that divided our country into a North and a South. And especially after that war period, my mom said that a lot of kids really took off because people still needed to pay for weddings and the 100-day celebration or to bury a loved one. And there wasn't really a system of banking that was viable after these 2 wars for many people. So it was either a moneylender or a ge. And I think that lots of our people probably can share stories like that if you go back a generation or 2.
What would stop people from not just taking the money and then leaving the gig because it was their turn, so they didn't have to keep doing the
always
contribution?
ask that. Maybe we're just cynical or something, Mina. And I have literally never heard of anyone running away and taking the pot. And I think partly it's because, like, if you and I were in a get together with 3 other people, I know where you live. Like, I can find you.
Yes.
I know how to get hold of you. So there's like trust built in. I think that's basically it, like trust and relationships.
And fear. You don't want to be shunned.
I don't want to be shunned.
Everyone would know that you were the person who
cheated
sprang from the gate.
Yeah. Can you imagine? I mean, that'd be really bad.
A shame. Yes,
Yeah.
that would be very, very bad.
Yeah.
But you bring up a really important point, which is what makes Gaia so exciting too. And so naturally, when you think about it in extension, where it becomes something that, yes, maybe initially it's not a charitable thing, but that it so easily translates into then having a charitable focus or, whatever, and then and using that structure and system to make it happen. And so the fact that it's rooted in a place, it's rooted in a particular community typically, and one that everyone's familiar with, are one of the benefits of giving circles, right? Can you just say a little bit more?
Yeah. So, that's what we're really supposed to be talking about, right? I mean, I forgot about that. So the Asian Women Giving Circle, which is a giving circle I started in New York City with a group of Asian women girlfriends. And in hindsight, I think I've realized that I started it because I never had Asian girlfriends ever in my life.
And you wanted Asian
girlfriends. And I wanted Asian girlfriends. I really did.
Well, it's hard, right? When you grow up so isolated. Newfoundland.
You had no option. You had no choices. And neither did I. And then I went to college, and I didn't really find Asian girlfriends there either, because they were kind of evangelical, a lot of them, and that wasn't really my people at that time in my college. So I think I started this thing because I wanted girlfriends. And now we're turning 20. And this is a group of women who we have seen each other get married. We've seen each other get divorced. We've raised kids. We've buried parents. We've welcomed fur babies. We've buried fur babies. We've adopted children. We've lost jobs, gained jobs, said goodbye to jobs. We've just been through a lot of life together, and I just love them. And they're just such an important part of my community in New York City, where I live, which is a big city. But being able to make a smaller home within it is so nice. And so I took these girlfriend gets that I was part of, and I realized at one of them that each of us around that Ippudo lunch table was making charitable gifts, but none of us was being that strategic about it. None of us had ever said, hey, why don't we focus our money on women and girls in New York City? Or why don't we focus our money on Asian American families in New York City? So that was the beginning of this idea. And then I took it to my friends, and we're like, yeah, let's do it. And we met for the first time in Millie Chan's living room, because she had the biggest living room, and that is a factor in New York City. And then 20 years later, we remain an all-volunteer group of girlfriends. We've expanded our circle to be more than my direct friends, thank God. And we've moved $1.5 million. I think we could move a lot more, but I'm really proud of that. And our fiscal sponsor is the Ms. Foundation for Women, which is awesome because they're just aligned, and they're the oldest women's fund in America. So we're super lucky to be hosted there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that you were able to then, for all of the administrative and whatever, you could connect with an established foundation, for example. Do you remember one of those early grants, how much you were able to give?
Yeah, I'll share. I mean, Sadi's heard this story a million times, but I'll share one. This is one of my favorite. You're not supposed to have a favorite child, right? But this is one of my favorite stories. 2009, there was a group of kids, activists, applied for a grant because they wanted to integrate the official Lunar New Year parade to include gay, queer, and trans people to march in the parade. At that time, you couldn't be out and march in that parade. They asked the Asian Women Giving Circle for $4,000. We were their only grant. Obviously, we said yes. And obviously, we were super excited to march with them when the day was coming. The night before the parade, they got official permission to march. And they were kind of disappointed because they wanted to crash the party. And we were a little bit disappointed too because we kind of wanted to crash the party. So our $4,000 paid for beer, Oreos, and art supplies so they could make puppet dragons and parade paraphernalia and a big banner. And we marched with them it was one of those beautiful, cold, perfect blue, crisp New York City winter days. It was in February that year. And we marched with them, and it was so much fun. It was a party in the streets. That night, Peter and I were making dinner for our kids, and I heard them interviewed on our local NPR station. They were covered in Time Out New York and the New York Times. They made history. And we were their only funder who wasn't like a blood relative, auntie, or cousin. So we got to make history with them, and this group of activists, Q-Wave, went on to do a lot of other cool things. And we funded them because we know, as Asian American women in lots of different Asian American families, we're Bengali, Japanese American, Korean, Chinese, Taiwanese, Hong Kongese, Indonesian, Filipino, we're from lots of different cultures, but in all of our families, it can be very difficult to be gay, and it can be very difficult to talk about being gay or to have a child who is gay. We knew this because it was our families too. And so we have funded in this area since day one of our inception. Another grantee partner said to us, "You are the first time we've ever gotten money from someone who looks like us. You are the first time we've ever gotten money from any kind of Asian American anything, because there's just so little organized philanthropy in our communities." Another grantee partner told us that getting a grant from the Asian Women Giving Circle felt like having a bunch of aunties cheering on the sidelines. And as much as I love the New York Women's Foundation, no one is ever going to describe them that way. No one's ever going to describe the Ford Foundation as a group of aunties cheering them on the sidelines. And honestly, that is, when I die, I want that to be on my gravestone. That is something that I'm so proud of, that this group of activists, who got 4,000, 8,000, 15,000 was our biggest grant, to do really amazing stuff in their communities. And I'm so proud that we are close enough that they ask us, because even as the New York Women's Foundation, which I love, they don't know about these projects happening so close to the ground. And often it's a giving circle that kind of knows, because we go to the same parties or whatever it is, proximity.
So there's two things I want to pull out of that story. One is the fact that if people underestimate what a small grant can do, because they feel like, oh, we're just a small giving circle, it can't do that much. The other thing that was so remarkable to read was that often once they were funded by a group, then other people were willing to fund them.
Yes.
The other thing that you talk about is the donor having a relationship with the person that they're providing support and funding to, which I think really takes away what can often feel like a very transactional relationship between the donor and the grantee, where you're kind of having to, it's almost a little bit like a quid pro quo.
Yeah.
So talk about how giving circles, the unique nature of them with regard to the fact that they tend to be very connected to whatever entity they're trying to support.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is power, and in philanthropy, there's sort of an inherent power imbalance between the group or entity or person that gives the money and the group or entity or organization that receives the money. It's inherent, and it's a tension that I navigate daily in my work, not always well. And I think that those of us in the sector who are kind of trying to change it at the same time that we're working within it is just a tension that we feel. Giving circles ameliorate that tension and that power dynamic somewhat, because most of us live very closely to the things that we fund. Most of us are very local to the things that we fund and the neighborhoods and communities in which we fund. Almost most of, someone, Sadi here runs Philanthropy Together, who has done two, I keep looking at her because we're like sisters in the work, and Philanthropy Together has published two really wonderful research projects recently that describe the power of giving circles, and one of them is that we tend to be local and fund local. And now that proximity has become sort of a buzzword in the larger big Phil philanthropy, one of the things I'm just like hammering is, well, just match giving circles. Like if you're a philanthropist or a donor or a family foundation and you really want to get dollars to the grassroots, a super easy hack, I think, is just find a network of giving circles and match those dollars, because 99% that money will go very, very local.
Yeah. One of the examples that you give of how not to do philanthropy is the one that I remember well, because I actually used to be a teacher in Newark public schools,
right.
But I was not a teacher at the time that this big grant from Mark Zuckerberg of $100 million to Newark Public Schools that was brought, through efforts by Cory Booker, who was then the mayor, and Governor Chris Christie, who was then the governor, and so on. $100 million, an incredible amount of money for this district that I got to know pretty intimately well, and was stunned to think about what is possible, right, with this incredible contribution. But one of the things that they didn't do, which you point out so clearly, is they just didn't consult the community who really knew what the issues were.
Yeah, they had hubris. They swooped in with high-paid consultants, and from another coast. It's almost like the image that came to mind as I was doing this research was a crusade, like coming in on a horse to a land far away to sort of impose your religion on a group of people that might not really want your religion. But in this case, it was a certain kind of educational pedagogy being imposed, and reform the reformsters of that time, right? It's a neoliberal reformist ideology that was imposed by these three men who wanted to make big names for themselves in education and politics. And over the course of a few years, it ended up just being kind of a disaster. And I picked that story, but I could have shared so many more of with very good intentions.
Yes.
No one is like evil in this story, And
there weren't. It wasn't like there were no winners
exactly.
in that situation as well.
Right.
There were.
Yes. Yeah. And charter schools being the primary winner, actually, right? And Dale Rusakoff wrote a great book and a bunch of articles if you want to read about it. But there's so many stories of Big Phil behaving in this kind of manner, which is, coming in, swooping in from outside. And I think that's really not what we want to be doing.
So then if people want to start their own giving circle, how should they get started?
They should just do it. So we were just talking in the green room, like there's, it's a little bit of a metaphor throughout my book, but our sector can tend to get very constipated because of things that's not taking enough fiber, because of things like strategic plans and KPIs and wanting to find the most best perfect project or the most best perfect fit. These things can kind of tend to gum up the gears and not move the money. So for giving circles who are thinking about getting started, first thing I would do is go to the Philanthropy Together website, because there's a ton of free stuff on there. Like, how do I run my first meeting? How do I have a values-based conversation? What are some things I should do as icebreakers for this group I'm convening? And then secondly, build in learning, humility, making mistakes into the sort of founding DNA of the thing that you're going to build, and gather with your friends. Don't make it too big. Like, I sort of like to think about the number of people that can comfortably fit around your kitchen table. And then just do it. Don't overthink it, and don't strive for perfection. Do one thing together. That one thing together might be like a group of my girlfriends got together and we decided to go to eat at a Palestinian restaurant that had been opened by a Palestinian immigrant. And we hadn't been there before, and we wanted to go there together as a group to show our support. When I needed to cater something for a friend's event that was happening, I ordered my food from her. It doesn't have to be pulling money right away. Another group of my friends, they get together to write postcards and make phone calls around political issues that they care about. Another group of friends might get together and decide to send one person to the city council because my block is obsessed with rats and trees right now. So it can depend on the circle at that time. Think about who can fit around your table and do one thing together. That's how I would start.
And how do you make it not feel exclusionary?
It might at the beginning. My recommendation, think about your kitchen table, but add a leaf or two. And so the kitchen table is a metaphor in my book as well. And the important thing about adding a seed or two or a leaf or two around your kitchen table is that it invites some people in who are not your regulars. And again, don't think you're not the UN, so if I'm going to invite a group of friends over, they might be moms with kids who are young adults, because that's my natural friend group. So if I want to add a leaf or two, I might decide to invite some people who don't have kids or who live in a different neighborhood. We don't have to think about the Middle East. So just take a manageable bite-sized thing that you can do and invite some people who wouldn't be part of your first circle.
Yeah.
I think that's how we can start.
There's also something else that you describe, which is that after a certain amount of time, you have a values check-in with the group. What is that?
I tell a story, and I don't know if this is the one you're thinking about. Affirmative action is a big topic and an important one, and it can be kind of loaded in Asian American communities. In New York City, the public specialized high schools are really hard to get into, and historically they've had a really disproportionately high rate of Asian American kids in them. So the idea of imposing anything else on that can be very hard for some Asian American families to absorb and deal with and talk about. I'm on the side, I'm a pro affirmative action personally and politically, and it aligns with my values. But we lost a Giving Circle member because she disagreed, and she thought that affirmative action was going to harm her kids' abilities to get into the most selective New York City schools and then later into the most selective colleges. These were a series of conversations that happened over a course of a few years. They were values-based conversations about what affirmative action looks like in our communities, what it looks like for women, what it looks like in other communities of color. And this woman, who's super smart and very nice, and we're even, friendly to this day, she just was reading the room in a way and decided that she wanted to leave the circle because most of us disagreed with her on this one particular issue. I shared in the book because we were able to have these conversations in a civil manner where we disagreed, but there was no fighting. It didn't have to become acrimonious, or there were no punches thrown or kimchi flung. We could disagree about this thing, but we could agree about a whole host of other things that we can still raise money for together, come together and activate for, whatever. So that's an example of a hard values-based conversation. I think it's also true that most of us want to be good parents. Most of us want to be good neighbors. Most of us want to work hard and take care of our families, and we want our kids to have as great a life as they can have and live into all of the opportunities that they can have, right? These are also shared values and values-based conversations that we can have with people who might have really different who might vote for really different candidates during a presidential election, for example. I made a point of including in my book a couple of stories they happen to be men who come from deep generational Republican Party roots and families in the northern Midwest. I also grew up in the Midwest. My dad has voted Republican most of the times that he's voted in America. And I made a point of including them in my book because I really admire them for lots of reasons. Like, as I describe, if I was a neighbor with these guys, I would want them to have a key to my house. They're upstanding, good citizens, decent people, hard workers. They're really decent guys, So I think it's this kind of conversation and connection that I hope I invite people to make and lean into in this book. I became aware of this group called Unlikely Allies recently, and they became activated around the Wisconsin Supreme Court race that just happened, and thank God the candidate I backed won. But this is a group of people who are cops, veterans, and faith people. So people who wear badges, veterans of wars and for American military, and people of faith. And they've come together to get active in elections and politics and policies around the country around issues that have to do with things that working families care about. Public education, clean water, access to health care, good health care, public housing. And I think that there are these places that we can find where we can come together to be bigger than the sum of our individual opinions and bigger than the sum of our individual parts.
You really see these giving circles as having the potential to be sort of a new community commons at a time when those kinds of spaces are declining in this country.
I do. And a question I think I would love to hear what you guys think, like what is secular church? Oh, great. What does secular church look like? I don't go to church. I don't live in a dorm anymore where I could just go to the dining hall and talk whatever I want to do with my friends. Like, most of us don't have these places anymore, you know? So where can we find these places where we can have meaningful conversations about things that are important to me and things that are important to my kids and my family and my block, And I think giving circles are not the only vehicle. They're not the only way, but they're a really good way and an easy way that anyone can do, even if you're not a billionaire, in order to come together with your friends and neighbors and colleagues to talk about what's important to you and then do one thing together with that group. And I think, and if I've written this book well, I land in a space that has to do with civic engagement. And giving circles are a place to exercise our civic engagement muscles. And if ever there was a time when we need to do that in this country, it is right now.
Yes, that is something that was very top of mind for me when I was learning about your book and what you were recommending. Right now, it really does feel like, with the Trump administration pulling back on federal funding and even trying to claw back appropriated funding as well, what a lot of people are saying is that the role of philanthropy, the role of donors to try to fill the kinds of gaps for the services that may have traditionally been filled by government, or just to be able to counter some of the effects of the pullback in federal support, means that it's going to become more crucial than ever. That is how you see this moment too, it sounds like.
Well, I actually really believe in government. And I think sometimes when Big Phil has had to step in for vaccination programs, say, oftentimes it's a failure of government to vaccinate its citizens, And I actually applaud Bill Gates for this week's announcement that he's going to give away 99% of his wealth by December 31st, 2045. And he's going to close the foundation doors on that same date. And I applaud him. He's expediting this thing, that pledge that he signed, and along with 200 or 300 other billionaires, he's going to expedite that timeline, which is the right thing to do. And I'm hoping that he can influence and nudge his billionaire friends to do the same thing. What was your question?
It's basically the same thing around this moment is a moment, right? When I think we all believe in government, right? But when philanthropy is going to become even more crucial in a lot of people's eyes, donors trying to fill.
Yeah, I think it's true.
I guess the bigger question is, do you think that, based on what you know about the philanthropy sector, based on everything that you're trying to accomplish, whether we'll be able to meet the moment, right? This moment that we're in right now.
I don't think philanthropy can meet this moment, honestly. Just look at the scale. Like if philanthropy is human-sized, government expenditures in America and capital markets, like the stock market, are T-Rex size and hippopotamus size. Like the scale of philanthropy is so small, And that's partly because there's a dumb rule in America that if you have a foundation, you only have to give 5% of it away. So if DAFs and foundations gave more than 5%, then we would maybe become like 2 people size, but we won't ever become as big. It's just hard to see a day when philanthropy is moving as much money as government expenditures and capital markets. So what I see some individual philanthropists doing is moving all of those levers. They're getting really involved in political action, giving money to candidates and PACs, and we see that on the right, we see that on the left, we see that across the board, and also really aligning their investment capital with their values in the same way that they do their philanthropic capital. And that's a way to be much more influential than just with philanthropic dollars alone. But we just have to vote this guy out of office. That's the only way we're going to stop and change what's happening right now, and his buddies.
Well, we've got some questions from the audience that I want to make sure that I ask. This audience member writes, can you speak to the implications of giving circles, collective mutual aid, and the role of government? I love the idea of community wealth creation and worry that we may absolve government of their duty to provide public goods and services. Ooh, right?
I think we kind of talked about that.
Yeah.
Right? I believe in government for sure.
Yes, but I guess what is philanthropy's best role then, besides just voting folks out of office? You've really connected giving circles to a more robust and healthy democracy.
Yes, because we need to be more civically engaged, and philanthropy as a form of civic engagement is an awesome use of philanthropy.
Yes.
And not relying on the billionaire, not relying on Big Phil. All of us in this room can be part of a group of people who are doing good together. And I promise, I will bet you money that you will have fun doing it. I bet you money that you will vote more. Some of you will run for office. Some you'll volunteer more. You'll live longer, and you'll be happier. I will bet you money across the board. And we didn't even talk about loneliness.
Yes, I was going to say, right? You also mentioned that it can be a cure for loneliness.
Yeah, I really think, it's a little bit, it's not a panacea for everything, but it is something that we can all do. And loneliness is literally killing us in America and in other countries. Dr. Vivek Murthy's beautiful letter in People magazine and elsewhere, and also the big report that he wrote before he left as Surgeon General of the United States. Loneliness is as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day and drinking 6 glasses of wine a day. We are dying younger and awfuler because we're lonely. And loneliness is one of those things that has an internal, like, psychic aspect and also a social, external one. And the cures for loneliness don't have to cost a quadrillion dollars. The cure for loneliness is belonging. And, happily, giving circles are a great way to build belonging. They're not the only way. There's lots of, people join churches, they get therapy, they start meditating, they connect with their friends and neighbors to have dinner, having dinner with people, But giving circles are a really great vehicle for building belonging, which also happens to be a great way to fight this loneliness epidemic.
So the other thing that I think contributes to a really healthy democracy is the fact that if you're expanding the definition of what counts as philanthropy, and you're expanding it to include what these giving circles are doing, they are then seen as resources, right? And there is nothing more powerful, it feels like, in the US than when you are defined as a source of money or a source of something that you can give to somebody. And that's power too.
Totally, because like I just said, Giving Circle members give more, we volunteer more, we lift up our sleeves and drive people around more. We just get engaged in all the things that actually, and we serve on boards more. All the things that nonprofits and charitable organizations in the United States need. We do more of. So I think it's a good thing to cultivate.
This person wants to know if you can talk about what's going on, if you have a window into what's going on with nonprofits having their funding pulled by the current administration.
It's terrible. People are having to lay off staff. It's devastating what's happening in the nonprofit sector. It's devastating what's happened in the international NGO space that I know less of. It's horrible. Full stop. I don't have any great insight. On the donor side, one of the things I've been advising some of the people that I know and work with through my work is, if you have a favorite nonprofit that you have supported for a long time, just call them up and give them some money for legal assistance. A lot of nonprofits are paying for lawyers that they didn't think they would have to pay for 2 years ago. Call them up and just ask how they're doing. Call them up and give them money for just general operating. Call them up and give them money for staff care and support. Every nonprofit leader I know is struggling right now. Many of them are dealing with budget cuts of 50% or more. So if you have been someone who's been supporting a nonprofit or a foundation for a long time, just call them up and ask them what you can do.
As a local nonprofit Asian American arts organization, how can we connect with these Giving Circle groups?
That's a great question. There is a Giving Circle directory on philanthropytogether.org. Sari Lomelina is sitting right here. You can also go to Grapevine. Sorry, Sari. But this Giving Circle directory exists on the PHT website and also Grapevine. And you can search by state, zip code, issue area. A lot of Giving Circles are hosted at community foundations or a local women's foundation. So that's another good place to have a look.
This person wants to know, how do you recommend handling Giving Circles with friends of different financial means? I believe many of these groups involve everyone giving the same amount of money.
That's a great question. And Giving Circles are as different as the people who found them. So sometimes it is like, I know one young person in Arizona who started a Giving Circle by everyone throw in the price of a latte a week, So Starbucks lattes are kind of expensive if you're a kid. And that was the amount that they decided on. Seiji is a friend of mine, and he's in the book. He has a Giving Circle with a group of friends in Bed-Stuy called the RAD Fund. And Bed-Stuy is the neighborhood next to where I live, Fort Greene. And they came up with this thing called Formula One, which devises an estimate based on your income and your wealth. And they have Giving Circle members within RAD Fund whose income ranges from $50,000 a year to someone who makes $500,000 a year. And the hard and admirable thing about Seiji's Rad Fund Giving Circle is they talk about it. So, and they're a group of friends who live near each other, and they are united by their love of dancing. Literally, it's how they describe themselves on their website, their love of dancing and their belief in the liberation of all of us. And they do this Formula One together. And imagine, like in a group of friends, you're talking about, okay, what's 1% of my income and what's 0.1% of my wealth as an expected contribution. And as Seiji describes it, they're kind of hard on the math, but soft on the application. So if I just bought my first apartment, so I'm a little bit asset rich but cash poor right now, that factors into my contribution that year. If my kid is just graduating from college and I don't have to pay that tuition anymore, I'll talk about it with this group, and that might factor into my contribution that year. So I just really admire them for their rigor, but also their humanity in coming up with this Formula One. A pretty common way is to just say, try to make this giving circle one of in your top 3 of your charitable or philanthropic destinations this year. And that's a pretty gentle way of letting people come up with a number that fits them, but also asking them to prioritize that giving circle pot in their thinking.
That's the other benefit of giving circles, is it makes people talk about money.
Yeah.
And to get comfortable talking about money,
Yeah.
which we really need to do to be able to understand what the disparities are.
Totally. And I mean, I don't know, in your families, were you advised never to talk about sex, money, or politics?
I don't know that we were ever advised in that direction, but we kind of rarely talked about
Yeah, it was like or maybe it was
like
an unsaid, unwritten tacit thing, like especially for girls.
Yeah, but my mom loves to talk about money.
Yeah, maybe that's a Korean mom thing, because no, I wouldn't say my mom loved to talk about those things, actually. Like, she was probably a believer in that tacit, unwritten rule, but actually sex, money, and politics are the most important things that we should be talking about.
And I also think that when we did talk more about money was when we lost a lot of money, right? So that's when it's okay, to be able to discuss it in real and open terms.
Yeah.
This person wants to know, what is the best piece of professional advice that you received, and who was it from?
My God, that's a hard one. Well, it makes me think of Erica Fox. She was my boss at Planned Parenthood, and my first job out of college was organizing pro-choice marches in Jefferson City, Missouri, and Topeka, Kansas, which are the state capitals of Kansas City, where I grew up. And Erica Fox taught me how to organize. And she, in my mind, as a 22-year-old, she was old, which meant she was probably 35. And she, was a little matronly and very Midwestern, and very, very Midwestern. Like, she was cheerful, and she talked to strangers, and I just really adored her. She taught me that, like, baking cookies was sometimes a really good thing to do when you were trying to convince someone to do something you didn't want them to do. She taught me how to organize in the halls of state capitals and also in agricultural fairs. I got my first piece of hate mail from Wichita, Kansas, which is where Operation Rescue is based. I was scared. I was so scared. It was written in blood and sent to my home address in Kansas City.
Wow.
Or fake blood, I'm sure. And she's the one who held my hand and said, it's going to be okay. Like, I just learned a lot from her. She taught me about bravery and being an organizer, but also being kind of a matronly Midwestern lady. And I don't know if you're even still alive, Erica, but thank you.
Even as established and as successful as you've been in the philanthropic world, are you still made to feel like you don't belong within certain philanthropic circles?
For sure. I mean, I tell the story of the guy at Stanford who literally almost spat in my face. He was so mad that I was challenging him. And he literally said, well, Holly, maybe you don't belong in this room. And this was a room of philanthropy professionals not that long ago. And, it hurt because he was kind of right. Or I felt like he was kind of right. I did have that sort of feeling like, wow, maybe he's right, So I think it still does.
Do you remember what you were challenging him on?
Yeah, we were fighting. We disagreed a lot. And he's a proponent of strategic Big Phil style philanthropy, metrics driven, the idea that philanthropy is values neutral, that good philanthropy benefits people equally.
Oh, yes, I remember.
Do you remember this story?
Yeah, I remember reading it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was challenging him because he's wrong. And I asked him to consider.
Well, you asked him for an example of what is values neutral.
Thank you, Mina.
Yes.
And he said medical research is an example of funding medical research is an example. Yeah, thank you, Sarah, you're laughing, which is, I did not laugh. I controlled myself and did not laugh in front of him. But he was saying that funding medical research is an example of funding of philanthropy that benefits everyone equally. So I just said, well, have you heard about the Tuskegee experiments on Black men and Henrietta Lacks and the fact that health outcomes are disparate for women, and they're especially disparate for Black women. And he couldn't answer me. And I was like, give me another one, Paul. His name is Paul. And he became so mad that he turned red and he literally spat. Maybe you don't belong in this room, Holly. And it became a whole thing because this exchange was overheard by the staff, some of the staff who had convened us to be part of this small group. And eventually, Paul was asked to leave that collaborative because he misbehaved, and he was part of a Big Phil, like, retire in peace, Big Phil. Like, thank you for your service, but we need to make room for other voices and experiences.
Yeah. Which is a pretty big outcome considering how initially silent everyone was after all of that.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
It's true. It still happens, unfortunately.
This audience member writes, now that your book is out, is there a story that you wish you could have included?
Oh my God, so many. The cutting room floor is tragic. And thank God for Sarah Reed and Maggie Cooper, my agent and editor, because they made me fight for the stories that made it. Otherwise, this book would be like 1,000 pages long. So hard. But I'm going to tell the Aka story. And Aka is my mother-in-law, and Aka is 96 years old. And a few years ago, when she was a spry 92 or 93-year-old baby. She lives in rural Connecticut, and she became aware of a race that was happening in the state legislature. I can't remember if it was the House or the Senate, and it was maybe the House. And there was an effort to flip a seat that was held by an incumbent who was a Republican man, and there was an effort to try to flip it to a younger candidate who's a woman and a Democrat. So Aka reached out to the campaign manager and said, how can I help as one slightly older lady to help flip the seat? So they had a couple calls, and the idea was that Aka, who's lived in this town since the 70s, so she knows a lot of people, that she could host a weekly tea party around her kitchen table. And her kitchen table seats 8, so if there's a spot for the candidate whose name is Maria and a spot for Aka, that leaves 6 spots around her kitchen table. So she hosted about 12 weekly tea parties at her home over the course of a summer. In November, the election happens. It was so close it went to a recount. And after the recount, the challenger, Maria, won that race by 64 votes. Oh. And the campaign manager in the debriefs she says that Aka's tea parties made a material difference in flipping that seat from red to blue. And I love this story because if my 96, then 93 or whatever, mother-in-law can do it around her kitchen table, certainly we can, And that's a great example of someone using her kitchen table to do good and to be bigger than the sum of its parts.
So besides getting more donors, what is one thing that you hope will change in the philanthropy space in the next 5 years?
Oh, gosh. I mean, what do you guys think? Half of this room works in our sector. Get the money out fast. Okay, so there's, how many trillions of dollars are sitting in DAFs? Does anyone know off there? It's trillions and trillions. So DAFs are donor-advised funds.
Oh, yes.
Commonly called DAFs. If I win the lottery tomorrow and make $10 million, I could put $1 million, or I don't know, I could put the whole thing in a DAF at Fidelity or Schwab or Vanguard and benefit and take the tax deduction right away as soon as we could change tax laws. Yeah. Yes, that's a good way. It's rife with inequity because it's a vehicle for wealthy people to store their wealth. if I park my money in that DAF that I won in the lottery, that money is not circulating in the form of taxes to do things like fix potholes or to hire the police or pay for a fire department or pay for public schools. It's not circulating charitably, which is what it was meant to do if I put it in a DAF, because there's no law that says the DAF has to distribute that money at any rate. That it could stay there until I die, and then my kids or their kids could figure out what to do with it generations hence. So that's a super, I think, obvious thing to challenge and tackle is what are the DAF distribution laws, and can we just get more people to move more money out of their DAFs? Fidelity has a whole pot of money that they give philanthropically, charitably, because of all this leftover DAF money that people forgot to give away. So there's a lot of money that's just sitting that's not being used for the purposes it was meant to be used for.
Yeah. One of the things that I actually didn't realize until I read your book is that Americans are actually real givers. They're real generous. They are a donor nation. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I start with de Tocqueville, which is kind of funny, right? Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about this funny thing that he observed in the 18-somethings, hundreds, I forget when it was. Does Holly Lloyd know what year, though? 1860s, I think, visiting America, that we're a funny nation because we just tend to get involved in these organizations and volunteer and give together. What he forgot to write about, of course, was that before he got here, there were millennia of Native and indigenous folks practicing collective giving before. But it's also true, he picked up on something that we Americans have done ever since we Americans have been a country, which is come together and help our neighbors. That impulse remains to this day. Like we remain a nation full of people who volunteer and donate. I think Indonesia and Kenya are more generous and volunteer more and care about their neighbors more, based on this one international survey that happens every year. But we come in at number 3 or 4 almost every year. When you look at the giving data, Sun is getting a PhD in philanthropy. Correct me if I'm wrong. But when you look at the giving and philanthropic and charitable data, we Americans give more, and volunteering and giving are more popular activities than having sex and watching football, unless it's the Super Bowl, and then more Americans watch the Super Bowl than give or volunteer. That was a fun thing to investigate.
Yeah. Did that surprise you?
Yeah, it did. But it's sort of maybe I work in the sector, so I have friends who volunteer and give. But almost everyone I know volunteers or gives. How about you?
Yeah, in some form, right? When
Right?
you include that and you take it out of the definition of traditional philanthropy in the way that we view it.
And then
right?
if you count remittances sent home or cash to individuals or giving to political causes, then the number goes up. And the goofy thing about our sector, philanthropy as a professional sector, we only count 501c3 giving as philanthropy. So we don't count the trillions of, how much money goes in remittances? I don't remember. Is it billions or trillions? Billions. Okay, billions. Okay, thank you, Rajiv. Okay, Rajiv Khanna from Thousand Currents, thank you. So hundreds of billions of dollars goes from Americans to countries of origin. That doesn't get counted in the philanthropic data. Money, cash to individuals doesn't get counted. Political giving of any kind doesn't get counted. So I don't know what it would be actually if we added up all those different forms of generosity. And when we were building the Donors of Color research and the network, we asked about that giving because everyone we interviewed, I've interviewed 150 wealthy people of color across this country. It was the funnest project ever, as you can imagine. The cutting room floor is also tragic for that report that I got to write. But the giving, once you start asking about giving and generosity in that way, not only do eyes light up, but the number just grows and grows and grows and grows.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so important. We've talked about the kind of ripple effect that giving has. It makes us more civic-minded and so on. But just leave us with the personal effect, like what it did for you to see yourself as that person, to define yourself in that way.
The first word that comes to mind is sisterhood. Like this group of Asian women girlfriends. The Asian Women Giving Circle We're celebrating our 20th year, and they're my sisters. In this big city of New York City, we fight, we laugh, we drink, we eat, we go out and do stuff. They come to my house with literal Tupperware because they know that's how we rock and roll when we meet, So I'm just so grateful to them. Thank you for being my sisters in the work, and thank you for making my life in New York City that much more familial. And thank you for being here tonight and for reading my book.
It all comes. It really all does come down to that personal sense of belonging that we started this conversation with.
It does.
Thank you, Holly. It's been wonderful to chat with you. Thank you earlier to Aisha Curry for the beautiful introduction. And we encourage everyone to pick up a copy of The Big We here or at your local bookstore if you can. My name is Mina Kim. Have a great evening. Thank you and take good care.
Thank you, Mina.